you look at Bonelab on Steam or Twitter, you're going to find a lot of apparent disdain towards it. Lots of complaints that it's nothing like what the fans wanted or expected, and that the first game, Boneworks, is a lot better. And to be honest, I disagree. You could probably tell from the literal half minutes of clips that I showed prior to opening my mouth that I have found a lot to enjoy in this game. And I think people don't realize that there's more to it than the campaign experience. Now, don't get me wrong, the campaign in Boneworks is phenomenal, as is the game itself, but only after a dozen hours or so I felt like I was quickly running out of stuff to do, and even with the rudimentary modding scene that the game had, as I 100%'d the game, I came to the realization that what was left to enjoy was just a flicker of what could be. A wholly moddable, uber replayable experience that we didn't get. I stopped playing. The mods were too few and far between, and what existed just didn't interest me. People wanted a much more elaborate yet easy to understand campaign for Bonelab, but honestly, I think, like with many Stress Level 0 games, there's a greater emphasis on showing the technology by creating a unique and interesting experience. Making another set of Boneworks levels, but this time you can be a small Neko with oversized tits that's got the same stats as Ford, and that would have just been boring. And to be honest, if all Stress Level 0 wanted to do was add a single custom model import feature for the player and like one new level, I think they could have just done an update. Now, mind you, it had been an update that I would have played and loved, but by the time 1.6 rolled out, I was kind of burnt out on having the same experience, but in kind of different scenarios. I just felt that I experienced all there was to do in Boneworks, and I only milked like 80 hours of the game through just endlessly replaying the same long-ass campaign levels, just with different challenges or mods to keep it interesting. Now, 80 hours is nothing to sneeze at. That's a pretty good amount of bang for my buck, but the novelty of Boneworks was wearing out fast, and I was just craving more content. Also just improved mechanics and a lot more appetizing modding scene. So when Bonelab was teased, did I get uber excited? Hell yeah. It pretty much just looked like how I imagined a Boneworks 2 would look. Just more guns, the actual vehicles, and then the story that builds upon a lot of the random plot threads and ideas vaguely introduced in Boneworks and other Stress Level 0 games, and more importantly, modding. With that said, let's talk about the first thing that's changed between the two. Now, Bonelab is not shy about thrusting players into the deep end. With Boneworks, you had the break room and museum levels, which gradually exposed players to his mechanics and Ford's janky-ass body, but instead with Bonelab, they give you a cinematic intro sequence with a brief tutorial and then throw you into a shootout and finally crash you into the lab where you're basically set free to just do whatever you want in this activity center of sorts. You can check out the various levels or just pop in and out to meet the requirements of the campaign and be on your merry way. Or I guess you could immediately download a Neko furry avatar mod and just admire your tits for 45 minutes. That'd be boring on its own. Maybe you could sometimes look away from the mirror and slap forward. That might just work. Regardless, you'll quickly waltz into some of the fun core gameplay pieces of Bonelab, like shooting guys, bullying Ford, parkouring, solving puzzles, and just exploring anything and everything you can. The stuff you find in the lab are all surprisingly polished and just highly replayable. Some things admittedly have a semi-poor impression, like Dungeon Warrior being a little bit too hard and lengthy, but others are pretty much instant hits like the Arena and Sandbox. And already, when you just load up any map, you run into what I love about Bonelab. So much of it is just a better, more focused and polished version of Boneworks, in most aspects. The gunplay feels more fluid and fun, especially with the extra variety that shotguns introduce, and the way that each avatar feels unique and interesting to play just trumps the longevity of being Ford in an anime skin. And additionally, just a lot of the levels are more visually interesting, despite being kind of smaller in scale and more contained to fit on the quest. And I think that's a very polarizing difference there. Boneworks had some absolutely Leviathan levels in comparison to Bonelab. Like, in my first playthrough of Boneworks, like right around the time of launch, I had to completely give up because the game just made me tired, or sometimes even sick, and I would just have to replay segments to get back to where I left off, because there wasn't a save system and the levels ran on too long. I mean, when I reached the end of the campaign, I felt it was all worth it, but I also can't neglect how much it kind of sucked at times. Contrast that to Bonelab, where the longest feeling levels are the last few, like Ascent and Home. And even then, those don't really get me confused, and I don't find myself lost, likely due to the fact that they're a lot more linear than Boneworks, which honestly isn't a bad thing entirely, because just the levels felt a lot quicker, and they still held a lot of the same amount of exploration and discovery as Boneworks, so I think it's a better length. Stress Level 0 didn't need to shove a weird save point system into the game because the levels literally played longer than they expected. Like, come on, seriously. Even the devs agreed to an extent. Boneworks levels just had too much girth and length.
The first thing we did after launch is look at like what's holding things back. And there was a couple like stuff we were able to do in the first couple days, but the big one was save points. Well, like 12 to 15% of people seemed like it was dramatically holding back their experience because they're like, they just can't play for long sessions. And the game was playing a lot more, it plays a lot longer than we thought it was originally, so save points were like few and far between. So we put the time into engineering a save point system, we found something we think works really well.
Also, I just want to say, based on my own experience, both the Boneworks and Bonelab's campaign just take about the same amount of time to complete, and going back to both for this review, I feel like they're both about 3 to 4 hours long. I think what made Boneworks feel a lot longer in people's heads is just each level was more spacious, and we were all just getting a lot more used to the controls and the feel of the game, which can slow you down a lot. Like, play through Boneworks again, but this time, like, you're actually a master of the controls. It's a lot shorter now, and I think that's kind of the length that the developers intended, but it wasn't the one that the actual player base got. Additionally, I think people talk down the campaign of Bonelab's because of the tonal difference. Boneworks is a lot more serious and ominous, and it feels like just far more of a grand of an experience, like a story that you really sink your teeth into. Bonelab, on the other hand, is just bursting at the seams with enthusiasm and quirkiness, all like, look at this technology we made. Just check out how just a few small but interesting new mechanics can bring about so much potential. And I couldn't agree more. Like, the gameplay potential in the body log alone is so great that I feel the biggest flaw of Bonelab, aside from the awful climbing controls, is that it doesn't even scratch the surface of just the iceberg of what the body log can even do. Okay, so I think this feature is a bit of a hit or miss with people. Some people just want to be a middle-of-the-road body that they can rely on, like Ford, which is fine, but to me, being just one thing all the time kind of gets boring after a while. Rather just kind of be something different. I mean, that's kind of the point of the entire game. I think this is probably just a me thing, but whenever I play a VR game with an avatar feature, I'm constantly just wanting to change things up. Like, for example, VR chat. I hardly play it, but when I do, I change my avatar like every few moments just because being in a different body is just surprisingly fun and interesting. I mean, look at how many people stare into mirrors in that game. Like, I don't have to show you footage of it, you've probably seen it. But unlike VR chat, Bonelab assigns stats to each avatar, giving them each their own utility and impactfulness. And I think it's a genuinely cool thing, just having my own selection of favorite bodies to suit the situation. A tall dude to climb, a powerful croc alien thing for melee combat and eating damage, an average dude who can just manage most things thrown at him, and an uber fast woman to get me where I need to go as fast as possible. I find myself changing my avatar surprisingly frequently, if only just to try something stupid like driving the go-kart with a supersized avatar or shooting an assault rifle with tiny hands. The sense of scale really comes across amazingly in VR, like, even thinking about it, it's just so nice. And that's in addition to having to abide by the physics and logic of being really big or small. It just adds to the immersion and enjoyability of it all. I feel that this feature on its own is something that will continue to keep me engaged for a long time. If I ever get tired of being a one-size-fits-most solution like Ford, I can just change it up and try some activities as a ridiculously big or small character. If you've never seen or tried it before, like, a self-imposed challenge like that can be interesting and change how you play the game by a huge amount. And I think that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because while the body log is amazing and poses so many cool gameplay scenarios, it's woefully underused like some of the other new features in the game. The go-kart. The most use the body log would see in a conventional playthrough of the campaign is probably all in the Ascent level, where they make very clear-cut scenarios for each of the avatars in the game, like using tall to get a battery, or fast to run on a conveyor belt. But in like typical Boneworks Bonelab fashion, you can just figure out your own way of just using one avatar, or just your own solution to any given puzzle. So not including more scenarios and more levels is just makes this mechanic seem potentially pointless to some more of the stubborn folks who don't want to use it. And I mean, for such a game-changing mechanic, I can see why devs would be hesitant to enforce its usage like super heavily. But I think making it only semi-required in one level, kinda at the end of the game, was probably a poor decision, and doesn't properly demonstrate the full capabilities of the feature. Obviously, exploration for collectibles and secrets will ask you to use the body log, but getting access to dev tools and using those instead of the bodies is pretty trivial, and also I'm led to believe tons of people just download a 1,000,000,000% completion save file online anyway, so most completely miss the opportunity to find these secrets and get the collectibles themselves, and then they complain that there's hardly any content when they skipped over literally 90% of the content. But at the end of the day, though, I still stand by the body log, because it addressed an issue that Boneworks had, which was that the main character, while incredibly kawaii and memeable, is kind of try to play once you've figured him out. Like, I feel so capable, yet so limited as Ford. And eventually, that capability shrinks, and you feel just more and more limited. Like, why can't I just be a strongman and lift something over my head? Why can't I just shoot an assault rifle with one hand, as cursed as it is? It's just, being one person all the time kinda sucks. And speaking of kinda dry, I'm gonna make a somewhat controversial statement and draw a comparison between Boneworks and Bonelab, which I kinda hadn't done in a hot minute, because I was talking about a feature that is only in one of the games, but I think Bonelab has the better soundtrack. Now, obviously, to call the Boneworks soundtrack, aka Bone Tones, bad is just objectively wrong. That soundtrack fucking slaps. Yes, with the fuck word. Analog Sunrise, the song you're hearing right now, it single-handedly turned Boneworks into Bonerworks. But since this video is sort of a weird review comparison, I'd not be doing my due diligence in trying to convey my opinions about one OST relative to the other, and so I have to say that the variety and greater use of just like actual songs with lyrics and not just solely super video gamey background music made me purchase the soundtrack of Bonelab so I can listen to it. I mean, I have Bone Tones right here and I love it, but I can only listen to it through like once and think about how fun it was to play Boneworks before I'm pretty much done with it for like 6 months. There's Analog Sunrise, Bone Rhapsody, Pick It Up, and Who Am I, which I can probably listen to a few times in a row or throw it into like some random playlist just cause they're that good, but those are more of exceptions. Now, compare that to Lab Jams, where there's Don't Fence Me and Put It Down. Would you even know? Dream World. My Control. Knew before. Take a Ride and Turn Around and just tons of other amazing background tracks, the levels and activities, and like, I mean, I could listen to this stuff for a whole lot longer and more frequently. While Bone Tones had this incredible and unforgettable motif, you know the one. Lab Jams decided to have a few key songs that share a kind of like common plot-related theme of being lost and disoriented, unsure of who you are, and sometimes one of my favorite just topics and lyrics is just technology. In addition to that, there's just a lot more wow moments in Bonelab. Stepping out of a bunker to find silly music playing as you're presented with a space-themed sandbox, drifting around in a racetrack to Eurobeat music, or just blasting Nolman with appropriately John Wick-like club murder spree music. Like, they're strong. Those are some strong moments. Now, Boneworks had a few moments like that, sure, like the museum puzzle and hearing Analog Sunrise and stepping out into the tower level and being like, oh my god, this is a big level. Or just seeing the System Clock boss fight and hearing the dramatic music play. But those are just a few compared to like a ton that you find in Bonelab. As a result, like, Bonelab just felt more memorable for a different reason. It definitely lacked the same sort of hard-hitting story moments as Boneworks, but it was just a lot more fun, colorful, and interesting in a multitude of other ways, and just says, screw it, like every level, something cool happened right now. And I think that's a better way to demonstrate the technology that they developed. And you know what else Boneworks lacks in comparison to Bonelab? Mods. Okay, so this is turning out to be a bit of a Leviathan video, and I can't jam janky save points into an MP4, so I'll start to wrap things up as I talk about the end-all be-all of the Boner game experience, mods. Obviously, you can open up Thunderstorm for Boneworks right now and yell in my ear, "There are mods for Boneworks!" And I can't disprove that, I can't really argue it, so I guess checkmate for you. But I gotta ask you, are those mods really that good? Like, is there comparable quantity to Bonelab? To be fair, for both games they have roughly the same ratio of Avatar and Sandbox map mods to really cool, actually, like, new content mods. But because Bonelab makes modding easier, there's just a far larger quantity of mods in general, and so you, instead of just finding like 3 really cool gun mods in Boneworks, you can find like 30 in Bonelab. The official SDK tools right now, as of this video, are pretty lackluster for Bonelab, but hopefully they'll improve and add more features, so making really cool mods just opens up to more people. But for now, the extended SDK has proven to be surprisingly reliable and already allows for guns, NPCs, campaign maps, and even built-in weapons into avatars. Like, look at this stuff. You didn't get very many of these with the Boneworks modding scene. And me, being the type to be a huge nerd emoji and make their own mods, the process is way better for Bonelab. Like, with Boneworks, even modding in an avatar was a whole process, and a very unfun one at that. You basically had to follow a few slightly sketched links to get a model of Ford, plus his animation rig, and then you scale your character to be Ford's sized and shaped, and then copy the weights from Ford to your character, and then you have to separate the head and hands into their own mesh and make sure the weights are right, and then that the bones are generally in the right spot compared to your custom model. If not, you gotta pose your model, and that can cause a lot of distortion sometimes. It just might not even turn out looking how you want it in the end anyway. Then you gotta apply the armature modifier because you posed them and distorted them and shrunk them down. And then you gotta like just pray that the gods will export correctly because Blender's kind of a crappy application. Oh, and make sure you uncheck add leaf bones, by the way. And then once you're done, you gotta take the community and export the package and you gotta add. To say it was a giant undertaking just to put a waifu into the game is an understatement. It was a process that people did, but like, man, I could only pump out like 2 or 3 models before I just got bored and realized that I didn't even want to touch the more advanced stuff like levels or interactive items, because if it takes that much effort to add in a player model, I don't know if I have the time for anything more cool. And I think it seems like a lot of people agreed with me that this process kind of sucked, because only a few persistent folks put out mods for Boneworks, and no offense, but even fewer made mods that were worth booting the game up again for. So when Bonelab promised and kind of delivered on better modding tools, I was pretty stoked to use them. Compared to what was in Boneworks, they're just far more simple and elegant and actually usable. Like, I eventually got the process of creating custom avatars down to just like a few minutes in Unity, and then it's good to go. And speaking of making mods, I have a few that are public and can be downloaded right now, actually, but the bulk of the ones that I have, and you probably saw a few of them, are privately passed around between me and my friends, and I think just it's really cool being the guy who has my friends approach me and go, "Oh yeah, could you add this into the game?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, sure fam, I gotcha." But I'll leave plugging my okay quality mods to the description though, and move on to the fact that there are way better like mods that are just made by far more talented people on Mod.io, just in general, like because of the easier modding tools. Now, using the extended SDK sounds like about the same process as modding Boneworks for, you know, the unofficial items like NPCs and such. But it seems a bit more streamlined or easier in a few ways. I mean, I actually figured out how to make an NPC in Bonelab versus being too stupid to do it in Boneworks. So, something's different. Now, despite it being still kind of difficult to work with, the extended SDK has lent itself to just allowing people who are a lot more dedicated to just learn it and produce some genuinely amazing content that you cannot miss. Like, if you played Bonelab's campaign and wanted more, just pop open the Mod.io page and check the tag for campaign style levels, and you will find some very promising projects in there. And if you're the more creative sandboxy type, then you're good in that regard too, because there's plenty of guns, avatars, melee weapons, weird gimmicky items, NPCs, cameras, mirrors, vehicles, and just more waiting for you to mess around with. I know a lot of people make this comparison, but like, Bonelab 100% is just the Gmod of Boneworks. You're given a lot of player-created content, and you can just do whatever you damn well please with it all. Additionally, there's already some pretty janky multiplayer mods that have some really neat feature sets, like being able to climb on other players or having other players pick you up. And on top of that, they all support modded content too, like right out of the box. So, I mean, I cannot tell you how fun it is to just be bashing your friend's head in with a Dark Souls weapon, or to be Smo sniping a tea party that your friend set up, or just play multiplayer Bonelab with your friends. You'll come up with some cool antics. And if you're not the more creative types and you have your VRC legs and you can handle a bit of lag and desync, you can do the campaign with a friend. It's surprisingly stable for that somehow. So, in short, where Bonelab really beats out Boneworks is in the modding scene. It's just so populated with amazing content from almost anything you can think of, and that is enough to give me so much goddamn content that I could probably play Bonelab for hundreds of hours, possibly even break the thousands mark, which is not something I do very often. And so, when it comes to comparing value between Bonelab and Boneworks, it kind of depends on the experience you want. If you want the potential to really truly milk the game for all it's worth over the course of the next few years, and you love sandbox or arcade style games, get Bonelab. If you're looking for more of a one-and-done experience with a story that is just phenomenal and impressively well thought out in like explorative and interactive levels, try Boneworks. However, just know that Boneworks might leave you thirsting for more of that bonery goodness, and you're not going to find much more if you're not the completionist type. For that reason, and all the other reasons I rambled on about in this video, Bonelab is the better game. It's got all the content I could possibly want, and even if I had to turn to player-made and unofficial stuff to provide me with limitless hours of entertainment, like, that's not a bad thing. In fact, I think it's good that they allow for player-created content, because now there's just infinite content as long as the player base is interested in the game. Oh, and you didn't hear it from me, but there are people making the Boneworks campaign in Bonelab, so eventually you'd hardly even have to play Boneworks in the first place. Like, it even looks better in Bonelab. You just get the best of both worlds, just paying a little bit more for Bonelab. Just saying. Now, all this talking about Bonelab has kind of got me inspired to download a dozen mods and just go to town, so I think I'll cut it all off here. Bye!